Right, now this lesson is going to be another part of Unit 2, American West, looking at how homesteaders' problems were overcome in the years 1862 to 1876. But to do this lesson, we need to understand firstly, what problems did people face farming on the Great Plains in the years 1835 to 1862? That's the first learning outcome, to recap problems that homesteaders faced. Then to look at the solutions to the problems that homesteaders faced. And then we're also going to look at in a bit more detail something called the Timber Culture Act and evaluate the overall impact it could have had on America as a nation. Remember, homesteader, people were moving to America, they were moving to areas like the Great Plains. However, it's quite problematic as well, because the Great Plains was very difficult to farm on. So the first thing we're going to look at is why. So we did this in a previous lesson. We'll just quickly go through this because this is a much shorter lesson. First problem why farming was difficult on the Great Plains was low rainfall. The farmers that moved over to the Great Plains had half of the rainfall they were used to in the east of America. Crops can't grow without a steady flow of rainfall. And in the Great Plains, you're in the middle of nowhere. So there's no access to water. There's no access if you're stuck. It could take several days to walk to the best place. And to dig up a well is very expensive. Wells could be as deep as 300 feet down, so to actually do this was very difficult. Another problem is not enough wood for fuel, okay? Especially if you're in the middle of nowhere, the dusty Great Plains. Settlers did burn buffalo dung, but it burned very quickly, so you'd need a lot. Wood was very hard to access. Now, I want you to keep that in mind later when we look at the Timber Culture Act. No wood from trees, so settlers had to build their homes out of sods of earth. Sod houses were very warm and fireproof, which was good in the winter, but were always dirty, infested with insects, and if it rained quite heavily, they could turn into heavy mud. So sod houses had some positives, but also there were some significant concerns about these. Because you're in the middle of nowhere, making life on the plains very lonely. Nearest town takes several days. And this is before the railroad. It was very, very lonely, very, very isolated. The Great Plains also had very grass that made it very cow. And if you can't plough effectively, you can't grow crops. Normal ploughs broke under the spade. Farmers had to dig up the roof of the spade, which would have been very, very painful, very difficult. It may not have equaled success. And overall, hiring a sodbuster would have cost quite a lot. And this is the money that people didn't have, as they moved to the Great Plains thinking they could start again. Plains were dry and cold, and the concern the settlers weren't used to such a difficult area, weren't used to the land. So they got there totally unaware of how they could grow. The thing is, they on top of being very cold in the winter, the plains also got very dry and in aspects of hot weather, and prairie fires were very common. Now, if a prairie fire occurred, it could burn your crops and it could kill livestock and people. Fires could have started for many, many reasons. You could have had lightning, campfire sparks, and overall, this was very, significantly quite dangerous for the people that lived on the plains. And the one that near enough everyone remembers is the grasshopper attacks. Some years, vast clouds of grasshoppers sweep over the plains, destroying everything: crops, grass, wool off the sheep's back. And it did cause quite a lot of problems, a lot of disruption in the lives of settlers. It would have potentially destroyed their crops. They would have had to start again if they could afford it. And also the pollution, if they had any water, they could pollute the water with the grasshopper droppings. So these were the problems. What we need to understand, going back to the lesson objectives, is how on earth did the homesteaders overcome such significant problems? So the next bit I'm going to do is to explain the solutions, learning outcome 2. Right, now what you've got Again, I'll just draw this so you're aware. What you've got on this side are all the problems. So I'll add a quick text box here, just so you have an understanding that this side are the problems that people faced. What you've got the other side are the solutions. I'm just going to talk through these very, very briefly. Again, this is a really quick lesson, just so you get an overview. So firstly, water shortages. The way in which they overcame this in this period, due to technological advancement and due to the fact that there was more trade, more opportunity because of the railroad, there was a use of wind pumps. Now, the homesteaders built wind pumps which used a turbine to bring water up from deep within the grounds. Now, this again could pump quite deep into the ground, but there is a problem with this. And we'll obviously learn this a bit later on. But the problem with the turbines were they were made out of wood. They could be blown over. So even though this was a solution, there were still some problems to this solution. Okay, just quickly put that back in again. Wood equals falling over. Right. So that's the first thing that you could talk about in regards to the solutions, but there were some issues with the solutions. Growing crops. Crops were hard to grow on the plains due to the weather conditions. Now this changed because of the migration in America. You had different groups that came over to America that brought different crops. Now the Russians brought red turkey wheat. Now this was a different type of crop that could be used to grow in the West because it could cope with extreme temperatures. They grow a surplus and extra crops to make sure they would have enough. So red turkey wheat was proven to be successful in growing successfully on the Great Plains. Now, once again, it just is that understanding of what crops grow and what type of land they grow on. Fuel, lack of wood meant there was nothing to burn. Again, buffalo chip. The homesteaders copied the Indians and they just carried on using buffalo dung. Okay, because there was such a lack of wood, buffalo dung was the only solution that could be used, and you just needed lots of it. Natural hazards, insects, well, you couldn't do anything about this. There was nothing you could do to stop a swarm of grasshoppers. There was nothing you could do to stop a hot day in America, to stop fire. You just had to get lucky with the natural hazards and hope they didn't affect you on a common basis. Building materials, we've mentioned this. So the problem, the lack of wood, people used sod houses. I won't go into too much detail, but it says there they built their homes out of sod. And when the railway was built, it meant that some could afford to buy wood to build with. So when the railroad came about, some people did travel and buy wood, which was really useful. Okay, the railroad was significant advancement, especially for the settlers who were trying so desperately to achieve manifest destiny. You also had dirt and disease, easy to catch a disease from the sod houses. You had bugs, you had mice, you had snakes. Now this is where, and this isn't being sexist in any way, it was just the way in which some societies worked. Women were the solution here. They'd try their best to keep the sod house clean, and they'd also make herbal medicines when people were ill. So even though that's not significant on farming, it is significant on the health of the person to make sure they could continue their job. Protecting crops, animals could trample, can't speak today, all over the crops, especially as the cattle drives occurred. The main thing that helped with this was the invention of barbed wire in 1874 that could be used to fence off land. Now this did cause some conflict as time went on. Barbed wire was a significant step forward. We're going to look at it in a bit more detail when it comes to Unit 3. Weather extremes. Now, because it was really hot in the day and really cold at night, there could be strong winds that damage crops and homes. The solution here is something known as dry farming. Now, when there was heavy rainfall or snow, the farmers would plough their land to trap the moisture into the soil, which means that in terms of growth of the crops, it was going to be a lot more effective. And then ploughing. as we know, it was difficult to plough, but you had new machines that were made. You had something called a sulky plough that was made of steel. It was stronger, and because of the railroad, you could have parts replaced if it broke. So that's an overview of just how farming changed. And it is quite significant that you have an understanding that why this happened. And you could argue very much it's down to two things: migration and the railroad. But the third reason why settlers were beginning to be successful was because of this act that was introduced by the government in 1873, the Timber Culture Act. Now, under the Homestead Act, obviously families were given 160 acres to farm, and that was enough for a large family. But it wasn't enough for successful farming on the Great Plains, and this led to the Timber Culture Act being introduced in 1873, which allowed a homesteader to get another 160 acres if they planted trees on a quarter of it. Why are trees good? Well, number one, they act as a windbreak. The Great Plains were incredibly windy. If there were more trees, then the crops would be sheltered from winds damaging them. The second reason why trees were needed: provide settlers with timber for building houses, fences, and furniture, and also repairing equipment. And the third reason: provide settlers with fuel. Now, in regards to this, I know they had fuel, but it would have lasted longer than the buffalo chips, which is something that they really did need more of. Now, the Timber Culture Act was a correction to the Homestead Act that aimed to reduce the high failure of homesteads in the Great Plains. So, because there were so many people who weren't being successful on the Homestead Act and not proving up their land, this Timber Culture Act allowed people to plant trees and have resources whenever they wanted. Now, by 1878, 16 million acres had been claimed under this act, adding 50% more that was claimed under the Homestead Act. So this act here was more successful because there was actually a purpose to it. The Homestead Act was about giving cheap land. This was about giving them more land to be successful. The majority of the claims were in Dakota, Kansas, and Nebraska, but most of the trees planted died because there wasn't enough water from them. It was only in the state of Minnesota, which we've got here, where large increases in trees took place. People also took advantage of the act by claiming land and settling on it when prices were higher, despite never working the land, which means there was still some corruption in places. But the key thing here is that at the end of the day, it was a way that the government tried to make more wood available for the farmers, which in turn means they would be more successful. So this is an exam question for you to consider. I'm going to go through just a couple of things you could put into this exam. Remember, it's a linking X to Y question. Gets you the top marks if you link the two things. So in this case, you've got the Timber Culture Act. So you need to show that you know this. And then you've got settlement, people living / staying somewhere. So what could you mention? Okay, first thing, the fact that provided 160 acres to plant trees on. You had to plant 5 acres of trees. Why was that good for settlements? You could talk about the windbreak. You could talk about protection for your crops. You could talk about fuel. You could talk about housing and how it would have potentially removed the sod houses, which was going to be a lot more healthy and a lot quicker at times potentially as well. You could mention that the Culture Act provided an extra piece of land to help develop farming. Okay, you could actually write a paragraph on each of these to say about how it helped with settlement, especially focus on the housing, because the housing before caused a lot of disease. The sod houses, you know, if the woman didn't clean the house effectively, then it could lead to quite serious diseases, mainly cholera, especially if you have drinking water that got dirty. You could also get quite serious insect bites, which could lead to more problems in the long run, potential blood poisoning. As I say, this question is quite nice and simple. It was the first ever question that came up on the Edexcel GCSE paper, and they just wanted you to understand how this 160 acres of extra wood would have helped develop settlement on the Great Plains. Okay, once you had more wood, you could obviously then trade it, and it would be a lot more effective in the long run. So that, as an overview, is farming. It's a nice short lesson. It gives you plenty to talk about. As long as you see the difference from A to B, then you'll be absolutely fine. So the difference between 1832 and 1835 to 1862, and then how the period 1862 to 1876 caused quite significant development in farming.